In 30 BC, Roman soldiers entered Alexandria, and Egypt's last pharaoh lost the final fight for an ancient throne. The temples still stood, the granaries were still full, and the Nile still flowed. Yet Egypt's independence was gone, and the Mediterranean now had one master. It was the end of the pharaohs. This is the story of ancient Egypt over about 3,000 years. A civilization that rose from scattered Nile villages to pyramid-building kings, rebuilt itself after breakdowns, peaked as an imperial power, and then became the prize of foreign empires. But the catch was that the same system that created stability could also become brittle. When the Nile ran low, order cracked. When Egypt grew rich, rivals came for it. How did a kingdom that seemed eternal keep returning from crisis until it finally could not? Egypt's first great achievement was not a pyramid, it was unity, and it came with a cost. Around 3100 BC, communities along the Nile began to merge into a single kingdom, with a ruler later remembered as Narmer tied to that unification. The narrow river valley made travel and trade easy, so grain, labor, and authority could be gathered in one place. That meant stronger defenses and shared rules, but it also meant the state could demand more: taxes, work crews, and loyalty. Local shrines and leaders were drawn into a larger system, and a royal court began to speak in the language of divine order. But the catch was that once power centered on one throne, every dispute over that throne threatened the whole country. Egypt looked stable from a distance, yet its earliest unity already carried the seeds of future succession struggles. Egypt's most famous monuments were built to broadcast confidence, but they also revealed how much the state could squeeze from its people. In the Old Kingdom, roughly 2700 to 2200 BC, kings ruled from Memphis and directed resources on a scale rarely seen before. Reliable floods and careful administration turned grain into taxes, taxes into labor, and labor into stone, raising royal tombs at Giza under rulers like Khufu. The pyramids were not just graves, they were proof that order held, that the king stood between the Nile and chaos. And it came at a price, because the more the center demanded, the more it depended on officials and local governors to deliver. Over time, those local powers grew richer and harder to control, while the system assumed the river would always cooperate. Soon, a shock to harvests and authority would test whether pyramid-era stability was real or only temporary. When the Nile ran low, Egypt's sense of permanence cracked, and hunger turned politics into a fight for survival. Around 2200 BC, the Old Kingdom order began to unravel as weak floods and strained administration hit at the same time local governors grew more independent. Green shipments failed, royal projects slowed, and the center could no longer enforce obedience across the valley. Rival power bases formed, each claiming to protect order, but each also pulling resources away from any single throne. That's when the balance broke, because a system built on predictable floods and tight control had little room for bad years and contested succession. Egypt did not vanish, but it fragmented into competing regions, with short-lived rulers and shifting alliances. Yet this chaos also forced new leaders to prove themselves, not with monuments, but with food, security, and discipline. In the south, Thebes began gathering the strength to reunify the country and redefine what a pharaoh had to be. Egypt came back not by denying the crisis, but by tightening control over what had failed. Around 2050 to 1700 BC, rulers based at Thebes reunified the country, beginning with Mentuhotep II, and rebuilt the state as a more practical machine. Officials tracked land, taxes, and grain with new care, and royal power pushed deeper into the provinces to prevent another slow drift toward fragmentation.
Forts rose along the southern frontier, and campaigns and trade reached into Nubia for gold and resources that could fund the crown. But the catch was, the stronger the system became, the more it relied on steady harvests, loyal administrators, and long-distance supply lines. When those links weakened, the center could still look powerful while quietly losing its grip. By the late Middle Kingdom, pressure grew in the north as new groups settled in the delta, and Egypt was about to face a challenge that did not come from famine, but from foreign rule. Egypt did not fall to a single battle. It slipped into a split, and outsiders filled the gap. In the Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1700 to 1550 BC, royal authority weakened again, and the delta broke away from the south. In the north, the HYKSOS established a court at Avaris and ruled part of Egypt through alliances, tribute, and control of key routes. They brought new military tools, including horse-drawn chariots, and that shifted the balance of power in a land built around river transport and fortress lines. But the catch was, foreign rule also forced Egyptians in the south to reorganize, train, and adapt the same technologies to fight back. Thebes became the center of resistance, and the struggle turned into a long campaign, not a quick revolt. By the time Ahmose I finally drove the Hyksos out, Egypt had learned a hard lesson about vulnerability, and it was ready to push its borders outward so the next threat would be met far from the Nile's heartland. Egypt's greatest age of power was built on a simple idea: push the battlefield away from the Nile, or be ruled again. Around 1550 to 1070 BC, after expelling the Hyksos, New Kingdom pharaohs reorganized the army and turned Egypt into an empire stretching deep into Nubia and up into the Levant. Gold and captives flowed south to north, while temples and royal courts used that wealth to fund building, bureaucracy, and more campaigns. Rulers like Hatshepsut and Thutmose III treated war and trade as two sides of the same strategy: secure roots, then profit from them. But the catch was, empire made Egypt dependent on distant garrisons, loyal allies, and constant pressure at the borders. Victory brought tribute, but it also created enemies and expensive obligations. For a time, the system held, and Egypt looked unstoppable. Yet one internal shake would soon test whether this empire was held together by faith or by force. Egypt's most dramatic religious gamble began as a royal decision and ended as a warning about how fragile authority could become. In the 14th century BC, a pharaoh known as Akhenaten elevated the Aten above older gods and built a new royal city to anchor his reform. The court redirected attention and resources, and traditional priesthoods lost influence as the king tried to reshape belief and power at the same time. For a moment, it looked like the state could rewrite the rules of the cosmos. And it came at a price, because while Egypt argued over religion and legitimacy, imperial duties did not pause. Diplomacy faltered, loyalty on the frontiers weakened, and rivals tested Egypt's resolve. After Akhenaten's death, the court reversed course under younger rulers like Tutankhamun, restoring old cults and trying to repair the damage. The episode ended, but it exposed a deeper problem. When unity depended on one sacred center, any shock to that center could echo across the entire empire. Egypt held its empire together through a mix of brutal campaigning and careful diplomacy, but both demanded constant strength. In the 13th century BC, rulers like Ramesses II confronted powerful rivals in the Levant, fighting costly wars for fortresses, trade routes, and reputation. Battles did not always bring decisive victories, so treaties and marriages became tools of strategy, turning enemies into temporary partners when exhaustion set in.
That's when the balance broke, because maintaining peace across an empire still required armies, payments, and stable succession at home. As court politics tightened and resources flowed into temples and frontier defense, the system became heavier to carry. Egypt still looked magnificent in stone and ceremony, yet the borderlands grew more dangerous, and new waves of migration and conflict began to destabilize the wider eastern Mediterranean. Soon, Egypt would face not a single rival kingdom, but a regional breakdown that could swallow even great empires. Egypt survived the storm that crushed its neighbors, but it never fully returned to the same kind of empire. Around 1200 BC, trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean fractured, cities fell into crisis, and the great powers that kept the region stable began to break apart. As shortages spread and allies disappeared, Egypt faced attacks and migrations often grouped under the name Sea Peoples, forcing the state to fight at the borders while managing stress at home. Could an empire built on distant garrisons survive when the entire system around it was collapsing? But the catch was, even when Egypt defended itself under rulers like Ramesses III, victory did not restore the old network of wealth, diplomacy, and predictable supplies. War became more defensive, the costs stayed high, and the center's grip weakened as local power grew. Egypt endured, but the price of survival was a smaller horizon. And once the empire stopped expanding, the struggle shifted inward, toward the throne, the temples, and the provinces. Egypt's decline was not a single collapse, but a slow division where power leaked away from the crown. After about 1070 BC, pharaohs faced shrinking resources, rival claimants, and the rising authority of powerful temple institutions, especially around Thebes. Local rulers and military leaders took control of regions, collecting revenue and commanding troops in ways that once belonged only to the royal court. And it came at a price, because as the center weakened, Egypt became easier to pressure from outside and harder to reunify from within. Dynasties rose and fell in different parts of the country, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, while Nubian kings to the south watched closely, rich in gold and experienced in frontier politics. Egypt still carried the prestige of the past, but prestige could not replace unity. Soon, a new dynasty from the south would claim the title of pharaoh, not as conquerors of a foreign land, but as heirs trying to restore a broken order. Egypt's ancient crown became a prize in a wider struggle, and restoring unity meant inviting bigger enemies. In the 8th century BC, Nubian rulers from Kush advanced north and formed a new dynasty that tried to revive traditional styles, rebuild temples, and present themselves as guardians of old Egypt. For a time, the state looked whole again. But the catch was, the Near East had changed, and Assyria was expanding with disciplined armies and ruthless strategy. When Egypt became entangled in Levantine politics, Assyrian forces pushed in, sacked major cities, and shattered Nubian control. Local leaders re-emerged under foreign pressure, balancing survival with loyalty to whoever seemed strongest. Egypt's unity became temporary, its borders contested, and its rulers increasingly dependent on shifting alliances. The country still mattered, its grain, its river, its strategic position, but now it was playing defense in a world of empires. And the next empire waiting on the horizon would be even larger and far harder to resist. Egypt could still rebel, but every victory was shorter and every defeat came faster. In 525 BC, the Persian Empire conquered Egypt and turned it into a province, prized for its wealth and strategic coastline. Persian kings ruled through governors and local elites, and Egyptian temples continued many traditions, but sovereignty was gone. That sparked repeated revolts, brief periods of independence, and a constant struggle over who truly controlled the Nile. That's when the balance broke, because each uprising drained manpower and trust, and the constant switching of regimes made long-term stability harder to rebuild. A few native dynasties returned for a time, presenting themselves as restorers, yet they faced the same problem. Egypt's position made it too valuable to be left alone. When Persia returned, Egypt was pulled back into the imperial orbit. And while Egyptians fought to keep their identity and institutions intact, a new force was rising in the north, one that would conquer Persia itself and arrive in Egypt as the next liberator. Egypt gained new rulers who spoke Greek, but it did not escape the logic of empire. It was simply absorbed into a new one. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great entered Egypt, was welcomed by many as Persia's replacement, and founded a new city on the coast, Alexandria. After his death, his general Ptolemy took control and created a dynasty that blended Greek court culture with Egyptian religious legitimacy. The Nile's grain fed armies and cities across the Mediterranean, while Alexandria became a hub of trade, money, and learning. But the catch was, this wealth also made Egypt a battlefield for succession struggles, court intrigue, and foreign rivals who wanted its resources.
As Rome expanded, it treated Egyptian grain as strategic fuel, and it watched the Ptolemies closely. Egypt still looked dazzling. Temples rose, rituals continued, and pharaohs still appeared in stone. But the state's independence depended on fragile politics at court and shifting alliances abroad. And one final civil conflict would pull Rome directly into Egypt's fate. Egypt's last stand was not fought for pyramids or temples. It was fought for control of the Mediterranean world. In the 1st century BC, Cleopatra VII tried to protect her dynasty by tying Egypt's fate to Rome's most powerful leaders, turning alliances into survival strategy. Egypt's grain and money could still tip the balance in Roman civil wars, and for a moment it looked like the Nile might buy Egypt a future. And it came at a price, because when Rome's internal struggle ended, the winner could not allow a rival power base to remain. After the defeat of Cleopatra and her ally at Actium in 31 BC, Rome moved quickly. Egypt became an imperial possession, its wealth and grain directed outward, its rulers replaced by governors, its old monarchy ended. The temples endured and the language survived for centuries, but the political system that had once organized the Nile into a kingdom was gone. The story began with unity, and it ended with Egypt as the prize of someone else's unity. Ancient Egypt rose along a river that rewarded order, and for centuries that order seemed almost permanent. It unified early, built a state strong enough to raise pyramids, and repeatedly rebuilt itself after breakdowns by tightening control over land, grain, and belief. At its height, the new kingdom pushed outward, turning Egypt into an imperial power, until internal strain and regional collapse forced it back into defense. The same system that created stability also made Egypt vulnerable when floods failed, when succession fractured, and when wealth attracted stronger empires. That is why later centuries became a cycle of division, reunification, and foreign rule, from Nubian restores to Persian governors, and finally to Greek kings in Alexandria. In the end, Egypt's greatest legacy was not conquest, but continuity. Temples, symbols, and ideas that shaped the Mediterranean world long after the pharaohs. Without that long history, would our picture of ancient civilization look anything like it does today? If you enjoyed seeing 3,000 years condensed into one story, like and subscribe for more timelines, and comment what civilization should be next.